In the spring of 1913, a crew of masons was sent to underpin the nurses' wing of a tuberculosis sanatorium on a ridge in the southern mountains, a place I am going to leave off the map, and the foreman, a man named Isom Ratliff, put his bar through what he thought was the foundation wall and felt it swing into open air on the other side. There was a room behind the wall. There was not supposed to be a room behind the wall. The floor plans the county held, the ones the state inspectors worked from, showed solid earth beneath that wing. And when Ratliff widened the hole and put a lantern through, he found a long, low brick chamber running the length of the wing above it, and in it 2 rows of iron cots, and on a shelf at the far end, a bound ledger swollen with damp, and on the cots the things that had been left on them, which I am not going to describe yet, because the order matters. Ratliff came up out of that hole and did not go back down. He walked off the job that same afternoon, drew no more county work for the rest of his life, and by every account he gave no one, not his crew, not his wife, not the inspector who came, a single word about what was on the cots. This is the story of what was found beneath the nurses' wing, and of a place that was never lost. It was bricked over on purpose, by people who knew exactly what they were sealing in, and it was buried a second time before anyone was allowed to write down what it was. Let me be honest with you at the start, the way I always try to be, because a story like this is worth nothing if you cannot trust the man telling it. Almost none of what I am about to lay out can be proven the way you would want it proven. The chamber is gone now, and you will hear how it went, and that going is part of the crime. What survives is paper, an admission register, a discharge book, a separate rounds log kept in a nurse's hand, a state inspector's cover letter, and a mismatch between 2 numbers that no one at that sanatorium ever wanted anyone to sit down and calculate. None of these documents is frightening on its own. It is only when you lay them beside each other, in the order the ink went down, that they start pointing at the same thing, and the thing they point at is the room Isom Ratliff put his lantern into. You can decide at the end that this is a mountain rumour grown fat over a century. A good many careful people decided exactly that. All I ask is that you follow the paper in order, because the order is the whole of it. You have to understand first what a place like that was, and why its numbers mattered more than its patients, because that is the engine under everything. In those years, tuberculosis was the great killer, the slow one, the one that took the young, and the only treatment anyone believed in was rest and mountain air. So sanatoriums went up on the high ridges all across that country, and people sent their sick to them the way you would send someone to be saved. And these places lived and died on one figure, their cure rate. A sanatorium that could report that its patients got well, that they came in wasted and went home whole, drew the paying families and the state contracts and the charitable dollars that kept the doors open. A sanatorium whose patients died drew nothing. Death was not just a sorrow at a place like that. Death was a liability on a ledger, a mark against the institution's whole reason to exist. And this particular sanatorium, the one on the ridge, was famous. It reported one of the finest cure rates in the region, year after year, decade after decade. Patients admitted, patients discharged, recovered, improved, sent home to their families. The dead, in its published figures, were remarkably few. People pointed to it as proof the mountain air worked. The state pointed to it. The families believed it. And the belief was the product. The belief was the thing being manufactured up on that ridge, and I am going to show you how it was made. The woman I need you to know made part of it, without at first understanding what she was making, and her name was Effie Vance. She was mountain-born, from a cove not far down the same ridge, one of a large family with too many mouths and too little cash money, and she took the night nursing post at the sanatorium when she was 26 because it paid in coin and her people needed coin. She was, by the one account of her that survives, a steady and literal-minded woman, not fanciful, not given to stories, the kind of person you would want writing down what happened on a ward because she wrote down exactly what happened and nothing she imagined. And within her first year she was given a second duty in addition to her rounds on the upper wards. She was given the lower rounds. She was handed a separate log and a key, and told that certain patients had been moved to a quiet ward for the seriously ill where they would not distress the others, and that her job on those nights was to go down and tend them and write down how they did, and that the lower log stayed below and was not to be spoken of on the upper floors. She was 26, and her people needed the coin. She took the key. There is one detail from those early nights that she did put in the log, plainly, the way she put everything, and it is the kind of small wrong thing that stays with you longer than any scream. The stair down to the lower ward was stone, and it was worn. Dished in the center of each tread, hollowed the way stone only hollows under many thousands of passes of feet across many years. Effie Vance noted it in her first month, without alarm, the way you would note a draft. But the sanatorium was not old. The nurse's wing had stood barely a decade when she first walked down that stair. A stair used by 2 night nurses on quiet rounds does not wear hollow in 10 years. It takes generations of feet to dish a stone like that, and there had not been generations, and there had not been that many feet, and the stone was worn smooth all the same. She wrote it down. She did not explain it. Nobody since has. Now let me lay the papers beside each other the way the inspector finally did, years too late, because the papers are where the belief comes apart. Start with the admission register, the book that recorded everyone who came in, count them across the years. Then take the discharge book and the death book together, everyone who left, whether they left recovered or left dead, and count those. And the two totals do not answer to each other, not by a little. Across the decades that Sanatorium ran, hundreds more patients were admitted than were ever accounted for leaving, by any door, alive or dead. That is not a rounding error, that is not sloppy filing. That is hundreds of human beings who walked in through the front, appear once in the intake book, and then simply are not in any record of anyone ever leaving. They did not go home. There is no discharge for them. They did not die, officially. There is no death entry. They are admitted, and then the paper closes over them like water, and the surface of the record shows nothing but that famous, beautiful cure rate, gliding along untroubled year after year, because the arithmetic that would have troubled it was split between 2 books that no single person was ever allowed to hold at the same time. And that is exactly where I have to stop, because the next part is where Effie Vance's lower log stops being a nurse's dull duty book and becomes the most damning document in the case, and you deserve to read it in her own words rather than take my summary on faith. So I have put the whole of it into a written reconstruction, the admission register and the discharge book set side by side so you can watch the numbers fail to meet. Effie Vance's lower log transcribed entry by entry, in order, with the dates intact. The inspector's letter, and a plain drawing of the wing and the chamber beneath it, so you can see exactly where the lower rounds were walked. It is all linked below, and the code is on your screen. Take a moment and pull it up, because from here, it is her handwriting that carries the weight, and I want you reading it for yourself. All right, let's go on. Here is what the lower log shows, and here is the turn, and once you understand it, you will not be able to look at that cure rate the same way again. The patients on the lower rounds were not a separate population. They were the sanatorium's own patients, the ones who were not getting better. When a patient upstairs worsened, when it became clear the air was not going to save them, when they became, in the cold sense of the place, a death waiting to happen and a mark waiting to be made against the institution's record, they were moved, down, into the chamber beneath the nurse's wing, and here is the part that turns the stomach, because it was done with paperwork, calmly, in office hours. On the upper books, that same patient was written out as discharged, recovered, or improved, and sent home to their family. The discharge book gave them a happy ending in ink on the very week they were carried downstairs to die in the dark. The sanatorium got to keep its cure rate. The dying got moved off the ledger that mattered and onto Effie Vance's lower log, which stayed below, which was not spoken of, which no inspector ever saw. The story stops here being about a hospital with an unusually kind mountain climate, and starts being about an institution that discovered it could manufacture recovery on paper simply by relocating death to a place the paper did not reach. Sit with that one moment before I tell you the rest, because this is the hinge and I do not want you past it too fast. Somewhere out there, for every one of those patients, was a family that got a letter. Your daughter has recovered. Your son is improved and has been discharged. Come and collect them, or expect them home. And there were families that waited. There was a man, and his name is in the margin of one of these documents, a man named Vardis, who sent his girl up to that ridge and got back word that she had recovered and been sent home, and who spent the rest of his life not understanding why she never arrived, writing letters, riding up the mountain, asking after a girl the sanatorium swore had walked out its door whole and happy, when she had in fact been carried down a bricked stair to Effie Vance's ward, and had died there in the winter of a year I can name, 12 feet beneath the nurses who wrote the cheerful letter. That is the human cost of a good cure rate. That is what the number was made of. And it only makes sense when you see the discharge entry laid next to the lower log entry for the same person, the same week, one saying recovered and gone home, and the other saying died in the night, which is exactly what is in the written reconstruction linked below. If you passed it a moment ago, take 5 seconds and get it now, because what the inspector found when he finally added the two books together builds directly on this. The link is in the description, the code is on your screen. Now here is where it stops being only a fraud, and becomes the thing that Isom Ratliff would not describe, and that I told you I would come back to. Because when the inspector came in 1913, after the wall was breached, and sat down at last with both books open in front of him, he did the arithmetic that the whole system had been built to prevent. He counted the missing, the admitted but never released, and then he counted what was found in the chamber, the cots. The remains on them, Effie Vance's lower log, and the total of names she had entered over her years on the lower rounds. And the numbers did not close, even after you accounted for the fraud, even after you granted that every discharged recovered who never came home had in fact died below. There were more down there than that. There were entries in the lower log with no name at all, only a cot number and a date, and the same short notation Effie had begun to use in her last year, when she stopped writing what she saw and started writing only that the cot was occupied and then that it was not. And the count of those exceeded the count of the missing from upstairs. There were people in that chamber who had never been admitted to the sanatorium at all, who appear in no intake register, no upper ward, no discharge book, nowhere in the daylight paper of that institution, and yet who were tended on the lower rounds and entered by cot number and then not entered again. Where they came from, the paper does not say. How they came to be beneath the nurse's wing of a hospital that has no record of ever receiving them, nobody has ever explained. That is the thing nobody could explain. Not the fraud. The fraud is ugly, but it is human, and it closes. It is the surplus that does not close. It is the cots that held people the sanatorium never admitted, in a room the floor plan said was solid earth, and the response to that discovery is the coldest document of all, and it is where the refusal lives, because faced with a chamber that would not reconcile, the institution and the county did the same thing the institution had always done. They made it not there. The inspector's report does not survive as a report. It survives as a single cover letter, and in that letter he does not describe the chamber, does not enter the count into evidence, does not recommend an investigation. He recommends that the wing be underpinned as originally planned, that the chamber beneath it be filled with earth and lime and sealed, and that the work proceed without further examination. And the board approved it. Within the month the room Isom Ratliff put his lantern into was packed solid with fill and closed, and the nurse's wing was underpinned and went on standing above it, and the lower log and whatever the inspector had gathered were retained, sealed, and filed under a case number that leads, when you pull it today, to an empty folder. A grown man, a state inspector, sitting with the proof of hundreds of hidden deaths and a surplus he could not account for, chose to pour earth over it rather than write down what it was. He had the authority. He had the books open in front of him. He recommended burial without examination, and it was granted, and that is the whole of the payoff, and I am not going to invent for you what was on those cots that made a foreman walk off a job for life and an inspector fill a room rather than describe it. They were there. They had the lantern, the pen, the office. Every one of them chose the earth. Now you will want this to be one wicked hospital on one lonely ridge, and I understand the wish, but you already know how it rhymes. You know that the sanatoriums and the asylums and the poor farms of that era buried their dead by the thousand in fields marked with numbered stakes and no names, and that the ledgers matching the numbers to the people have a way of being lost, or sealed, or never kept at all. You know that institutions paid by the head and judged by their outcomes have always faced the same temptation, to move the inconvenient death off the page where it counts against them and onto a page no one reads. You know how many families across this country got the letter that said recovered, discharged, sent home, and then spent their lives on a question the institution had already closed in ink? We are taught to read the gaps in those old records as the ordinary carelessness of an overwhelmed age. Overworked clerks, lost books, fires, and some of it is that. But some of it is a room beneath a wing, filled with earth on the recommendation of a man who counted what was in it, and decided the county was better off not knowing. I am not telling you every numbered grave in this country has a chamber under it. I am telling you that one ridge kept an honest lower log of a thing the daylight books were built to hide, and it slipped through, because a foreman broke a wall he was not meant to break, and a nurse wrote down exactly what she saw until she could not anymore, and a county was careless enough to keep the empty folder that proves there was once something in it. Effie Vance did not stay to the end. The lower log stops in her hand a few years before 1913, mid-year, without ceremony, and the last entries are the cot number entries, the ones with no names, and then nothing. She resigned that winter, walked down off the ridge to her cove, and by every account she was a quiet, plain, unremarkable woman for the rest of her long life, who went to church and kept her garden and did not speak of the sanatorium, not to the historian who came around in her old age, not to her own kin, not when the wall was breached and men came asking whether she was the E. Vance, whose name was in the recovered log, she said she was not sure, she said it had been a long time, she kept her garden, and Vardis, the father, the man who sent his girl up whole and got a letter back saying she was cured, he died still looking, still riding up that mountain, still asking after a recovery that had been buried under the nurse's wing before he ever posted his first letter. As for the sanatorium, it ran a few years more and then closed the way those places closed. The cure passed out of fashion, the building sold, the wing standing over its filled chamber until it too came down, and whatever the earth and lime were poured over is under a good deal more than that now, unexamined, uncounted, exactly as an inspector recommended, and a board approved. So here is the question I will leave you with, and I am going to turn it on you directly, because that is where it belongs. You trust the number. You have always trusted the number. The cure rate, the success rate, the figure the institution reports about itself, the clean statistic that tells you a place is good and safe and works. You trust it because it is written down, because it is official, because surely someone would have noticed if it were not true. That sanatorium's number was beautiful for 40 years, and it was beautiful because the deaths that would have spoiled it were carried down a bricked stair and written up as recoveries and tended in the dark by a 26-year-old who needed the coin. So sit for 1 second with the possibility that a number can be perfect precisely because of what it was built to hide, that the cleaner the record, the more you might ask what it cost to keep it clean, and that somewhere the difference between the figure you were shown and the truth is filled with earth and lime, and left unexamined on the recommendation of someone who decided you were better off not knowing. And then ask yourself how many of the clean, official, trusted numbers you were handed today are clean for the ordinary reason, and how many are clean the way that ridge was clean. If you want the next one, subscribe, because next week I am going to take you to a poor farm cemetery 2 counties over, where the numbered stakes run to a figure the institution's own burial book cannot account for, and the caretaker's letter that tried, one time, to explain the difference before he too was told to let it lie. Take care of yourself. I'll see you then.